So, Grandpa, while we are sharing war stories, what is your kill count? The words cut across the wardroom like a blade, and Commander Brock Whitfield leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile of a man who believed he had already won. Must be impressive to earn a seat at this table. Laughter rippled through the junior officers seated along the polished mahogany. Crystal glasses caught the light from brass fixtures overhead. The USS Theodore Roosevelt carved through calm Pacific waters somewhere west of San Diego, her 5,000 souls preparing for tomorrow's Veterans Day ceremony. But tonight belonged to the officers' wardroom, to white tablecloths and silver service, to men in dress uniforms comparing deployments like baseball statistics, and to 3 homeless veterans who had been invited aboard as charity. Clement Adeyemi sat motionless at the far end of the table, his fork suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth. The donated suit hung loose on his 71-year-old frame, the sleeves too long, the shoulders too wide. His hands were weathered and cracked, fingernails carrying the permanent stains of years spent sleeping in places not meant for sleeping. A worn leather journal sat beside his plate, its cover soft from decades of handling. The room waited for the old man to crumble. Commander Whitfield was 38 years old, his uniform pressed to geometric perfection, his career trajectory aimed at Admiral stars. He had been assigned to coordinate this Veterans Day cruise, to ensure every dignitary and camera captured the Navy at its finest. The homeless veteran program had been forced upon him by public affairs. 3 broken men plucked from shelters and soup kitchens to serve as props in the service's annual display of gratitude. Whitfield had smiled for the cameras during the boarding ceremony. Now, in the privacy of the wardroom, his contempt flowed freely. "Come on," Whitfield pressed, his wine glass catching the light as he gestured toward the silent old man. "We have got a room full of combat veterans here. Real ones. I'm sure they would love to hear about your service. Where did you deploy, Grandpa?" "Cordell. Vietnam, maybe." More laughter. A lieutenant commander to Whitfield's left nearly choked on his water. Clement set down his fork. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but something about it made Chief Petty Officer Darnell Washington pause mid-bite at the adjacent table. The old man's hand had moved with a precision that did not match his appearance. Economical, deliberate, the kind of movement that came from decades of training the body to waste nothing. Washington was the ship's historian, 42 years old, working on a book about legendary special operations. He had spent years collecting stories, separating fact from fiction, myth from memory. He knew that the most dangerous men rarely looked the part. At the head of the table, Rear Admiral Patricia Vance watched the exchange with growing discomfort. She was 58, the keynote speaker for tomorrow's ceremony, a woman who had climbed through the ranks when such climbs were nearly impossible. Something about the homeless man's stillness bothered her. Something about the way he absorbed the mockery without flinching. Clement lifted his eyes to meet Whitfield's gaze. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, soft and hoarse from years of disuse. He said simply that he had stopped counting in 1979. The table went quiet for a moment before Whitfield recovered with a sharp laugh. 1979, he repeated. That is convenient. What happened in 79? You lose your abacus. The junior officers erupted again. One of them slapped the table. The 2 other homeless veterans, seated near Clement, stared at their plates. One was a Vietnam-era Marine who had lost his legs to a landmine and his home to the bottle. The other was a Gulf War medic whose hands shook too badly to hold a scalpel anymore. Neither spoke. Neither looked up. But Clement did not look away from Whitfield. His dark eyes held something the commander could not read, something that sat beneath the surface like a reef waiting for a hull. In exactly 4 minutes, Commander Brock Whitfield would wish he had never spoken those words. He would wish he had stayed silent, had shown the basic respect owed to any man who had worn the uniform. He would wish he had looked more carefully at the old man's posture, at the way he sat with his spine straight despite the ill-fitting suit, at the way his hands rested on the table with fingers slightly curved, ready. Because some questions are not meant to be answered at dinner tables. Some answers do not fit between courses of prime rib and key lime pie. And some men carry numbers in their heads that would turn laughter into silence, that would transform mockery into something far heavier. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. You might have a quiet hero in your own neighborhood, someone whose worn appearance hides decades of service most people will never understand. Stories like this one remind us that courage does not always wear pressed uniforms and polished medals. Sometimes it sits at the end of tables in donated suits, waiting. Admiral Vance cleared her throat. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the weight of rank, "perhaps we should move on to other topics." But Whitfield was not finished. He had wine his blood and an audience to impress. He leaned forward, his smile sharpening. "With respect, Admiral, I think our guests should earn their seats." He turned back to Clement. "What unit were you with, old-timer? What ship? Give us something real." Clement's fingers brushed the worn leather of his journal. Inside those pages were coordinates written in fading ink. Names of men who never came home. Dates that marked the boundaries between who he had been and who he had become. 40 years of weight pressed between covers soft from handling. He looked at Whitfield and asked quietly if the commander had ever been to Libya. The question hung in the recycled air of the wardroom. Whitfield blinked, thrown by the specificity. "Libya," he repeated. "What does Libya have to do with anything?" Clement said nothing more. He simply waited, his dark eyes holding steady on the younger man's face. At the adjacent table, Chief Washington felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Libya, 1970s. 1980s. There were operations in those waters that existed only in whispers, in classified files that would never see daylight. The old man in the donated suit had just named a ghost. The helicopter had come for him 3 days ago, thundering down from a gray California sky to land in a parking lot behind the Veterans Shelter on 5th Street. Clement had been sitting on his usual bench, the worn leather journal open on his lap, when the social worker named Maria found him and said there was something he needed to see. He had not wanted to go. He had not wanted to leave the routine that kept him breathing, the small rituals that marked his days. Wake before dawn. Fold the sleeping bag with military corners. Walk to the public restroom at the park for water and whatever washing could be managed. Find work if work could be found. Return to the memorial at sunset. Speak to the names. Sleep. Repeat. But Maria had been persistent. She had been working with him for 2 years, ever since she found him sleeping behind a dumpster during a rainstorm and refused to leave until he accepted a cup of coffee. She never pushed. She never pitted. She simply showed up again and again until showing up became something he expected. A Veterans Day cruise, she had said. The Navy invites homeless veterans aboard one of their carriers every year. You would get a rail bed, real food, medical attention if you needed. 3 days at sea. Clement had looked at her with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He asked why she thought he would want that. "Because I think you need to remember who you were," Maria said, "before you can figure out who you want to be." The helicopter ride had been the first time Clement was airborne in 26 years. The last time had been an extraction out of Somalia, bullets punching through the fuselage as the pilot banked hard over the Indian Ocean. His hands had not trembled then. They trembled now, clutching the journal against his chest as the California coastline fell away and the massive gray shape of the aircraft carrier grew larger on the horizon. The Theodore Roosevelt, 100,000 tons of American power cutting through the Pacific. Clement had served on her predecessor, the old Roosevelt, back when the world was divided into simpler enemies. He had launched from her deck in rigid-hull inflatable boats, disappeared into darkness, and returned with intelligence that changed the course of operations no one would ever read about. Now he returned as charity, as a prop, as an old man in donated clothes, meant to make the Navy look compassionate for the cameras. The other 2 homeless veterans on the helicopter had introduced themselves during the flight. Franklin Delacroix, 74, Marine Corps, lost both legs to a bouncing Betty outside Da Nang in 1968. He rolled his wheelchair with arms still thick with muscle and spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who had made peace with what the war took from him. Gerald Hutchins, 58, Army medic, served in Desert Storm, and came home to a wife who had left and a mind that would not stop replaying the children he could not save. His hands shook constantly, a tremor that made eating difficult and surgery impossible. Clement had said little during the flight. He watched the ocean through the small window and thought about coordinates, about names, about the weight of numbers. He had been born in Lagos in 1953, the son of a fisherman who taught him to read the sea before he could read words. At 17, his family scraped together enough money to send him to America to an uncle in San Diego who worked in the shipyards. Clement had stood on the docks watching the Navy vessels come and go, gray giants that seemed to hold secrets in their hulls, and he knew what he wanted to become. The recruiter had been skeptical, a Nigerian immigrant with barely passable English and no connections. But Clement had passed every test they put in front of him, scored higher than candidates with college degrees and family legacies, and when the time came to volunteer for the hardest training the Navy offered, he did not hesitate. Bud/S Class 52. Basic Underwater Demolition and SEAL Training. 1972. 143 men started. 23 finished. Clement was one of them. The instructors had tried to break him. They called him names that would have started fights anywhere else. They pushed him harder than the others, certain that the African would quit. But Clement had grown up hauling fishing nets in waters that could kill the careless. He had learned to suffer in silence before he learned to speak English. And when Hell Week ended and the survivors stood shivering on the beach at Coronado, Clement stood among them. The teams became his family. The operations became his purpose. For 26 years, he moved through the shadows of the world, doing work that would never make the newspapers, protecting people who would never know his name. He earned his trident. He earned his promotions. He earned a reputation that passed through the special operations community in whispers. Spectre, that was what they called him, because he moved like a ghost and struck like a nightmare. But ghosts do not get to keep the people they love. His wife, Adora, had understood. She was a nurse at the Naval Medical Center, a woman who had grown up in a military family and knew what the silences meant. She did not ask where he went or what he did. She simply welcomed him home each time, held him through the nightmares, and raised their 2 sons while he was away protecting strangers. When Samuel Okonkwo died in his arms on a beach in Libya, Clement came home different. Quieter, heavier. Adora held him anyway. When she died of a stroke in 2002, for years after Clement retired, the weight became unbearable. He would look at his sons, grown men by then, and see Samuel's face. He would sit on the porch they had built together and hear her voice in the wind. He would wake at 3 in the morning and reach for a woman who was no longer there. One night, he wrote a note. 3 sentences. I love you both. I'm sorry. Live your lives. He left before dawn and never went back. The streets had been easier than staying, easier than facing the life he had built and lost, easier than explaining to his sons why their father, who had survived wars and wounds and decades of impossible missions, could not survive the silence of an empty house. For 22 years, Clement had been invisible, a ghost among the forgotten, an old man with a journal full of coordinates and a trident tattoo hidden beneath grime and sleeves too long, until a helicopter landed in a parking lot and a social worker asked him to remember. Now he sat in the officer's wardroom of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, wearing a donated suit that did not fit, listening to a young commander mock him for sport. The leather journal sat beside his plate, containing every name, every coordinate, every number that Whitfield was so eager to hear. Clement had answered the question about Libya. The word hung between them like smoke. Whitfield laughed, but the sound was thinner now. Libya, he said again. Sure, Grandpa. I have been plenty of places you have never heard of. He reached for his wine glass, his confidence rebuilding. Why do you ask? You do some exciting supply runs to Tripoli back in the day. The 2 other homeless veterans kept their eyes down. Franklin's jaw tightened. Gerald's hands shook harder. But Clement simply nodded, as if the answer satisfied him. His fingers brushed the journal's cover, tracing the worn leather like a rosary. Inside were coordinates he could recite from memory. 32.9167 degrees north, 13.1 875 degrees east. The location where Samuel Okonkwo took his last breath. The location that Commander Whitfield had just dismissed as a joke. The wardroom settled into an uncomfortable rhythm after Clement's question about Libya faded into silence. Stewards moved between tables with rehearsed precision, clearing plates and refilling glasses. The clink of silverware against china provided a thin cover for the tension that had crept into the room. Commander Whitfield had returned to his wine, but his eyes kept drifting back to the old man at the end of the table. Something about the exchange had unsettled him, though he could not have said what. The homeless veteran had not defended himself, had not protested, had not done any of the things Whitfield expected. He had simply asked a question and then waited, as if the answer did not matter because he already knew it. At the adjacent table, Chief Petty Officer Darnell Washington pushed food around his plate without eating. His mind was turning over the fragments he had collected. Libya, 1979. The old man's precise movements. The way he held himself despite the ill-fitting clothes. Washington had interviewed dozens of special operators for his book, men who had done things that would never appear in official histories. They all carried themselves a certain way. They all had that stillness, that economy of motion that came from years of training the body to be a weapon. The homeless man had it. Washington was certain of it now. Admiral Vance excused herself from a conversation with the ship's executive officer and made her way toward the coffee service near the wardroom's entrance. She poured herself a cup she did not want, using the moment to observe the room from a different angle. The old veteran sat alone at his end of the table, the two other homeless men having moved closer to Franklin's wheelchair to escape Whitfield's orbit. She watched Clement open his journal and run his fingers down a page filled with handwriting too small to read from this distance. His lips moved slightly, as if reciting something to himself. A prayer, perhaps, or names. Vance had her own list of names. Men and women who had served under her command and not come home. She kept them in her head, not on paper, but she understood the weight of carrying the dead. What she did not understand was why this particular old man triggered something in her memory, some fragment of a briefing or a report from decades ago that she could not quite retrieve. Whitfield's voice cut through her thoughts. He had found new audience, a pair of lieutenants fresh from their first deployment, and he was holding court with the confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. The charity cases are a nice touch for the cameras, he was saying, his voice carrying farther than he intended. But between us, it is a waste of resources. Half of them are drunks or addicts. The other half are running some kind of scam. You know how many fake veterans there are out there claiming service they never did, wearing medals they bought online. One of the lieutenants nodded eagerly. Stolen valor, he said. My cousin caught a guy at a bar once, wearing a Purple Heart he definitely did not earn. Whitfield pointed at the young officer with his wine glass. Exactly. And you can bet at least one of our guests tonight falls into that category. He glanced toward Clement, making no effort to lower his voice. Probably bought those dog tags at a surplus store. Memorized some dates and places from Wikipedia. These people are professionals at working the system. Franklin Delacroix's hands tightened on the wheels of his chair. The Marine had been listening in silence, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out like cables. Beside him, Gerald Hutchins stared at the tablecloth, his trembling hands hidden in his lap. Clement did not react. He turned another page in his journal, his expression unchanged, as if the words being spoken about him were in a language he did not understand. But his posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders had squared. His spine had straightened. The slouch of the homeless man was gone, replaced by something harder, something that had been trained in a muscle and bone over decades. Chief Washington noticed. He set down his fork and leaned forward, studying the old man with new intensity. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. Clement Adeyemi was no longer trying to disappear into his ill-fitting suit. He was waiting. Admiral Vance returned to her seat, coffee untouched, her eyes still on the scene unfolding at the far end of the table. She had commanded men in combat. She had sent sailors into situations where survival was uncertain. She knew what controlled stillness looked like, the calm before decisive action. The homeless man had it. Whitfield was still talking, emboldened by the appreciative chuckles of his small audience. "You know what I would love to see," he said. "I would love to put these guys under a real interrogation. Check their stories against actual records. I guarantee you half of them would fold in 5 minutes." He turned fully toward Clement now, raising his voice to ensure the old man could hear. "What do you think, Grandpa? Would your story hold up under scrutiny? You got any documentation for all those exciting adventures in Libya?" The wardroom had grown quieter. Other conversations were fading as officers sensed the tension building. Even the stewards had slowed their movements, watching from the edges of the room. Clement closed his journal. The soft sound of leather meeting leather was somehow louder than it should have been. He looked up at Whitfield, and for the first time, something flickered in his dark eyes. Not anger, not fear, something older and colder. Recognition. He had seen men like Whitfield before. Young officers drunk on their own authority, convinced that rank and education made them superior to the men who had bled in silence, so they could wear their pressed uniforms. He had watched such men break in combat, had seen their arrogance dissolve into terror when the bullets started flying, and the training they had neglected became the difference between life and death. Clement did not hate Whitfield. He pitied him, but pity did not mean he would allow the disrespect to continue. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying the soft rasp of years without regular conversation. He said that he did not carry documentation. He said that the operations he participated in were not the kind that generated paperwork for personnel files. He said that some things happened in places that did not officially exist, on dates that were never recorded, for reasons that would remain classified long after everyone in this room was dead. The wardroom was silent now. Even Whitfield had stopped smiling. Clement continued. He said that if the commander wanted to verify his service, he was welcome to try. He said the records that did exist were buried in archives that required clearances the commander would never possess. He said that the men who could vouch for him were mostly dead, and the ones still living did not speak about what they had done. Then he asked a simple question that landed like a grenade in the silence. He asked Commander Whitfield if he had ever killed a man close enough to see the light leave his eyes. The question hung in the wardroom like smoke from a detonation. Commander Whitfield's wine glass had stopped halfway to his lips. The junior officers who had been laughing moments ago sat frozen, their smiles fading into uncertainty. Even the stewards had ceased their movements, standing motionless against the polished wood paneling. Clement waited. He had asked the question without malice, without aggression, with the same quiet tone he might have used to ask about the weather. But the words carried weight that pressed down on everyone who heard them. Whitfield recovered first, though his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. He said that was a strange question to ask at a dinner table. He said this was not some action movie where people compare body counts. He said civilized people did not discuss such things over prime rib. Clement nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. Then he returned his attention to his journal, opening it to a page near the middle, and the conversation appeared to be over. But the damage was done. The room had shifted. Officers who had been enjoying Whitfield's performance now studied their plates or engaged in quiet conversations with their neighbors. The homeless man had not raised his voice, had not made accusations, had not defended himself with anger. He had simply asked a question that exposed the hollow center of Whitfield's bravado. Admiral Vance watched the exchange with growing certainty that something significant was unfolding. She had spent 34 years in the Navy, had commanded destroyers and carrier strike groups, had sat in briefings where operations were discussed in euphemisms and coordinates. She knew that the men who did the darkest work rarely spoke of it. They carried it in their silences, in the spaces between words. The homeless man carried something heavy. She could see it in the way his shoulders bore invisible weight, in the way his eyes looked through people rather than at them. Whatever he had done, wherever he had been, it had marked him in ways that cheap suits and cracked fingernails could not hide. Chief Washington excused himself from his table and made his way toward the coffee service, positioning himself closer to the old veteran. His book research had taken him through archives and interviews, through official histories and unofficial whispers. He had heard stories about operators from the 70s and 80s, men who had done things that would never be acknowledged, men who had been ghosts before ghost became a fashionable term. He had heard whispers of a call sign that made even hardened veterans lower their voices. Spectre, an operator who moved through Africa and the Middle East like smoke, who extracted assets from impossible situations, who did the work that allowed admirals to sleep at night without knowing the cost. Washington had assumed Spectre was a myth, a composite figure built from the exploits of multiple operators, exaggerated through decades of retelling. No single man could have done what the stories claimed. But watching the homeless veteran sit in his donated suit, watching him handle Whitfield's attacks with the patience of a man who had faced far worse, Washington began to wonder. Clement turned another page in his journal, and his mind drifted back to the waters off Tripoli. 1986. Operation Silent Thunder, though that name existed only in memories now. The official records have been destroyed, the participants scattered or dead, the mission itself erased as if it had never happened. For men had inserted from a submarine, swimming through black water to a coast that bristled with Libyan defenses. Their target was a CIA asset who had been compromised, a man whose intelligence about Libyan naval positions could save thousands of American lives if he could be extracted before Gaddafi's security forces found him. Clement had been the team leader, 33 years old, at the peak of his abilities, with a decade of impossible operations behind him. His call sign had already become legend in the community, spoken with the same reverence reserved for the hardest men who had ever worn the trident. Samuel Okonkwo had been his point man. 28 years old, Baltimore-born, with a laugh that could fill a room and a steadiness under fire that made him invaluable. They had served together for 6 years by then, had saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Samuel called him Old Man Clement, called him Little Brother. The insertion had gone perfectly. They moved through the Libyan darkness like shadows, reaching the safe house where the asset waited. The extraction route was clear. The submarine would surface at predetermined coordinates, and they would disappear into the Mediterranean with intelligence that would reshape American naval strategy in the region. But war does not care about plans. The ambush came at the extraction point. Libyan special forces, tipped off by a leak that would never be identified, waiting in the rocks above the beach. Clement's team had walked into a kill box, and the only way out was through. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. Clement could still hear every gunshot, every shouted command, every prayer whispered in the darkness. He could still feel the weight of his rifle, the burn of brass ejecting against his forearm, the terrible mathematics of combat where every trigger pull was a calculation of survival. Samuel took point on the final push to the water. He always took point. It was who he was, the man who went first so others could follow. He cleared the last stretch of beach with covering fire from Clement's position, and for a moment it seemed like they would all make it. The shot came from a shadow they had cleared twice. A Libyan soldier playing dead, rising with a pistol as Samuel passed. The round caught Samuel in the side, below his vest, tearing through organs that could not be repaired on a beach in hostile territory. Clement killed the shooter. Then he killed 3 more who emerged from the rocks. Then he dragged Samuel to the waterline while the other 2 team members provided cover, while the asset they had come to save pressed a bandage against a wound that would not stop bleeding. Samuel died in the shallows, salt water mixing with blood, the Mediterranean carrying away pieces of him that Clement could not hold together. His last words were not dramatic. He simply looked at Clement with eyes that were already dimming and said to tell his mama he did good. Clement had never delivered that message. He had stood outside Evelyn Okonkwo's house in Baltimore 3 times over the past 38 years, and each time he had walked away before knocking. He could face armed enemies in the dark. He could not face a mother whose son had died because he was half a second too slow. The journal in his hands contained the coordinates of that beach, the date, Samuel's initials, every detail preserved in fading ink because forgetting was not an option, and remembering was the only penance Clement knew how to pay. In the wardroom of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, Commander Whitfield was speaking again, trying to recapture the room's attention with a story about his own deployment. But the officers were no longer listening with the same enthusiasm. Something had changed. The homeless man's questions still echoed in the silence between Whitfield's words. Admiral Vance caught Chief Washington's eye across the room. The historian nodded slightly, confirming what she suspected. The old man was not what he appeared to be. No one at that table knew yet how right they were. The dessert course arrived with mechanical precision, stewards placing plates of key lime pie before each officer while the tension in the wardroom continued to simmer beneath polished surfaces. Commander Whitfield had retreated into conversation with the executive officer, his voice lower now, his gestures less expansive. The confrontation with the homeless veteran had cost him something he could not quite name, a certainty that had carried him through the evening. Clement did not touch his dessert. He sat with his hands folded over the closed journal, his eyes focused on some middle distance that existed only in memory. The other homeless veterans had moved their chairs closer to his end of the table, a silent solidarity forming among the forgotten. Franklin Delacroix leaned toward Clement, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he knew what the old man was. He said he'd served with operators in Vietnam, had seen that same stillness in men who did work that never made the papers. He said Clement did not have to prove anything to these people. Clement looked at the legless Marine, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the understanding that exists between men who have seen the worst of what humanity can do and somehow continued living. Gerald Hutchins spoke for the first time all evening, his trembling voice cutting through the quiet. He said he was a medic in Desert Storm. He said he held a 9-year-old girl while she died from shrapnel wounds, and he still saw her face every night when he closed his eyes. He said the commander did not know anything about what service really cost. The words were not loud, but they carried. Officers at nearby tables turned their heads. Admiral Vance set down her coffee cup, her attention fixed on the 3 homeless veterans who had found each other in the midst of hostility. Whitfield heard too. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed as he watched the small gathering at the end of the table. The evening had not gone as planned. The charity cases were supposed to be props, grateful and silent, providing photo opportunities and nothing more. Instead, they had become a quiet rebuke to everything he represented. He could not let that stand. Whitfield pushed back his chair and walked toward the homeless veterans with deliberate steps. The wardroom fell silent as officers tracked his movement, sensing that the confrontation was not over. He stopped at Clement's shoulder, close enough that his presence demanded acknowledgement. The commander spoke with controlled precision. He said he had been patient. He said he had allowed the old man his moment of drama with questions about Libya and killing. But now he wanted answers. Real answers. He said if Clement had actually served, he would have a DD-214 somewhere, discharge papers that could be verified. He said he wanted a name, a rank, a unit. Something concrete. Clement looked up at the younger man, standing over him. The height difference was pronounced. Whitfield using his position to project dominance, the classic posture of a man accustomed to having his authority unchallenged. But Clement had faced men who wanted to kill him, not merely embarrass him. The commander's intimidation tactics registered as nothing more than noise. He spoke quietly. He said his name was Clement Adeyemi. He said his rank at retirement was Master Chief Petty Officer. He said his unit was not one that appeared on standard organizational charts. Whitfield's eyebrows rose. Master Chief, he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. The highest enlisted rank in the Navy. And I suppose you have a Medal of Honor hidden in that journal too. Laughter came from somewhere in the room, but it was thin and nervous. The junior officers who had been Whitfield's audience earlier were watching with expressions that mixed discomfort with curiosity. Clement did not react to the mockery. He said he did not have a Medal of Honor. He said the operations he participated in were not the kind that generated medals with public citations. He said he had a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Devices, and 3 Purple Hearts, but the circumstances of those awards remained classified. Chief Washington had moved closer, abandoning any pretense of casual observation. His researcher's mind was cataloging every detail, cross-referencing against the fragments of legend he had collected over years of interviews. Master Chief, Special Operations, Classified Awards. The profile was fitting together like pieces of a puzzle he had not known he was solving. Whitfield scoffed. He said that was convenient. All these impressive credentials that could not be verified. He said he had heard this story 100 times from men trying to work the system. He reached down and tapped the worn leather journal with one finger. And I suppose this contains all your secret missions, your classified adventures, your imaginary war stories. The touch was a violation. Clement's hand moved before conscious thought could intervene, closing around Whitfield's wrist with a grip that made the commander gasp. The movement was fast, precise, and utterly controlled. Non-attack. A boundary. Clement spoke, and his voice had changed. The soft rasp was gone, replaced by something harder, something that had commanded men in darkness and chaos. He said the journal contained names. He said it contained coordinates. He said it contained the locations where 47 men had died by his hand and 17 more had died under his command. He said it contained the last words of brothers who trusted him to bring them home and whom he had failed. He released Whitfield's wrist. The commander stumbled back a step, rubbing the spot where Clement's fingers had pressed against bone. His face had gone pale, the arrogance finally cracking to reveal something like fear beneath. Admiral Vance rose from her seat. She had seen enough. She had heard enough. The name Clement Adeyemi was triggering something in her memory, some connection she could not quite make, but knew was important. She addressed the room with the authority of her rank. She said this had gone far enough. She said Commander Whitfield would return to his seat. She said the dinner was concluding and the guests would be escorted to their quarters with the respect they deserved. Whitfield opened his mouth to protest, but the Admiral's expression silenced him. He was ambitious enough to recognize when pushing further would cost him more than victory could provide. He straightened his uniform, shot one last contemptuous look at Clement, and retreated to his table. But the evening was not over. Chief Washington had his phone out, typing rapidly, searching databases he had access to through his historical research. The name Clement Adeyemi, Master Chief, Special Operations, Libya, and then he found something that made his blood run cold. A reference in a declassified intelligence briefing from 1987. A single line, almost redacted into meaninglessness, that mentioned intelligence extracted from Libya by a team whose leader carried the call sign Spectre. Washington looked up from his phone and stared at the homeless man in the donated suit. The legend was not a myth. The ghost was real, and he was sitting in the wardroom of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, being mocked by a man who had no idea what he was dealing with. Chief Washington's hands were trembling as he scrolled through the declassified document on his phone. The reference was fragmentary, most of the text blacked out by redaction, but the pieces that remained painted a picture that made his throat tighten. An extraction operation, Libyan coast, intelligence that altered American naval positioning in the Mediterranean. A team leader identified only by call sign. Spectre. He looked up at the homeless man sitting 20 feet away, the man in the donated suit with cracked fingernails and a worn leather journal. The man who had just described holding 47 deaths in his hands. The man Commander Whitfield had been mocking for the past hour. Washington needed to be certain. He typed another search, cross-referencing the date mentioned in the briefing with naval records from the same period. What he found made him sit down heavily in the nearest empty chair. In March of 1987, a naval task force operating in the Gulf of Sidra had received last-minute intelligence about Libyan naval positions. That intelligence had allowed the task force to avoid an ambush that would have resulted in significant casualties. The source of the intelligence was never publicly identified. The operation that obtained it was never acknowledged. But the task force commander had written a private commendation that somehow survived the classification purges. It thanked unnamed personnel for their sacrifice and specifically mentioned that the intelligence had cost the life of one American operator. Washington thought about the initials he had glimpsed on the old man's forearm when his sleeve had shifted during the confrontation with Whitfield. S.O. Samuel Okonkwo, the point man who never came home. The wardroom was beginning to empty as officers finished their desserts and made their way toward the exits. The formal dinner was concluding, the awkwardness of the evening something everyone seemed eager to escape. But Washington could not move. He sat staring at his phone, trying to reconcile the legend he had been researching for years with the broken man who had been treated as a charity case. Admiral Vance approached his table, her coffee cup still in hand. She had noticed his reaction, the way his face had changed while staring at his screen. She asked what he had found. Washington looked up at her, struggling to find words. He said he thought he knew who the old man was. He said the name matched a reference in a declassified briefing. He said if he was right, they had just watched a commander mock one of the most decorated operators in SEAL history. Vance's expression shifted. She set down her coffee cup and took the seat across from Washington. She asked him to explain. He turned his phone toward her, showing the fragments of the document. He explained the operation, the intelligence, the task force that had been saved. He explained that the team leader's call sign was Spectre, and that the operation had cost the life of a point man whose initials matched the tattoo on the homeless veteran's arm. Vance studied the screen, her face growing more serious with each line she read. When she looked up, her eyes found Clement across the room. He had not moved from his seat. Franklin and Gerald flanked him like an honor guard, two broken veterans protecting a third from a world that had forgotten all of them. She asked Washington if there was any way to confirm the identification. He said he would need to make some calls, access some archives that were not available on a phone. But he said the details were too specific to be coincidence. The name, the time frame, the classified nature of the service, the call sign that appeared in whispers throughout the special operations community. Vance nodded slowly. She said she remembered that task force. She said she had been a young lieutenant aboard one of the destroyers. She said she remembered the sudden course change, the relief when they realized they had avoided something terrible, the rumors that filtered through the fleet about intelligence from an unnamed source. Her voice dropped lower. She said if what Washington was suggesting was true, then she owed her life to the man Commander Whitfield had been humiliating all evening. Across the wardroom, Clement finally rose from his seat. His movements were slow, the weariness of age and years on the street evident in every step. Franklin said something to him, but Clement shook his head. He picked up his journal and tucked it under his arm, the worn leather pressed against his donated suit like a soldier carrying his colors. He began walking toward the exit, passing tables of officers who avoided his eyes. The evening had exposed something uncomfortable, a truth about how the Navy treated its own when they fell through the cracks of society. No one wanted to acknowledge it. No one wanted to sit with the implications. Commander Whitfield watched from his position near the bar, his expression a mixture of wounded pride and lingering contempt. He had lost the confrontation, but he had not changed his assessment. The old man was probably some supply clerk who had inflated his service in a fantasy. The grip on his wrist had been surprising, but desperation could give anyone temporary strength. He intercepted Clement near the door, stepping into the old man's path with arms crossed over his chest. He spoke quietly, so only Clement could hear. He said this was not over. He said tomorrow, during the ceremony, he would be watching. He said if the old man tried to claim any recognition he had not earned, Whitfield would personally ensure he was exposed as a fraud. Clement stopped walking. He looked at the commander with eyes that had seen things Whitfield could not imagine. He did not respond with words. He simply reached for his left sleeve and rolled it up slowly, deliberately, exposing his forearm to the wardroom light. The tattoo was faded but legible. Coordinates in precise numerical format. A date. Below them, the unmistakable outline of a trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs, rendered in ink that had been embedded in skin decades ago. And beneath the trident, two letters that made Chief Washington inhale sharply from across the room. S.O. Samuel Okonkwo, the point man who died on a beach in Libya. The brother whose last words Clement had never delivered. Whitfield stared at the tattoo, his confidence flickering. The trident was not something that could be easily faked. The coordinates meant nothing to him, But the precision of the ink, the age of the tattoo, the way it sat on skin marked by scars that spoke of violence, all of it challenged his assumptions. Clement rolled his sleeve back down. He said nothing. He simply stepped around the commander and continued toward the exit, his worn shoes silent on the polished deck. Admiral Vance and Chief Washington watched him go. They had seen the tattoo. They had seen Whitfield's reaction, and they knew that tomorrow's ceremony would be different than anyone expected. The ghost of Libya was aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and he was done being invisible. The guest quarters for the homeless veterans were located 3 decks below the wardroom, a small berthing compartment with 4 racks and a shared head. It was modest by civilian standards, but luxurious compared to what Clement had known for the past 2 decades. A real mattress, clean sheets, a door that locked, running water that came when you turned the handle. He sat on the edge of the bottom rack, his journal open on his lap, the small reading light casting shadows across pages filled with coordinates and names. Franklin had taken the rack above him, the Marine's prosthetic legs removed and stored neatly beside his wheelchair. Gerald occupied the rack across the narrow aisle, his trembling hands finally still in the darkness. None of them spoke. The evening had drained something from all of them, exposed wounds that each man had learned to carry in private. But there was comfort in the shared silence, the understanding that existed between veterans who had seen too much and been forgotten by the country they served. Clement traced his finger down a column of dates. Each one marked an operation. Each operation marked a piece of himself left behind in some foreign darkness. He had never intended to become a legend. He had simply done what needed to be done, again and again, until doing became the only thing he knew. The call sign had been given to him after his 3rd deployment, when a team leader from another unit watched him move through a compound in the Philippines without making a sound. Like a specter, the man had said, like something not quite human. The name stuck because it fit. Clement had always been more comfortable in shadows than in light. But shadows were cold places to spend a lifetime. And when the operations ended, when the missions stopped coming, when the Navy decided he had given enough and sent him home with a pension and a handshake, Clement discovered that he had forgotten how to exist in the daylight. Adora had tried. God, how she had tried. She filled their house with warmth and noise and the chaos of their 2 sons growing into young men. She dragged Clement to barbecues and church services and family reunions where relatives whose names he could not remember asked questions he could not answer. She held him through the nightmares and never once asked what he had done to earn them. He had loved her more than he had ever loved anything. And when she died, when the stroke took her between one heartbeat and the next, Clement understood for the first time what it meant to lose a battle that mattered. His sons had been 24 and 26 when he left. Marcus and Daniel, named for saints because Adora believed in the power of holy names. They had their mother's eyes and their father's stubborn silence. They had careers and relationships and futures that did not include an old man who woke screaming in the small hours and could not explain why. Clement had convinced himself that leaving was a gift, that his sons would be better off without the weight of his darkness, that disappearing was the last act of protection he could offer them. 22 years later, sitting in the belly of an aircraft carrier, he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. The journal contained their names too, not on the pages of operations and coordinates, but on the inside of the back cover, written in ink that had faded but never disappeared. Marcus Adeyemi, Daniel Adeyemi, their birthdays, the addresses of the homes where they had lived when he last knew where to find them. He had looked them up once, 7 years ago, using a computer at a public library. Marcus was a surgeon in Atlanta, married with 2 daughters whose faces Clement had studied until the librarian asked him to give up the terminal. Daniel was an engineer in Seattle, divorced, no children, working for a company that built things Clement did not understand. His sons had become men without him. They had built lives and found success, and probably learned to stop wondering where their father had gone. Clement told himself this was what he wanted. He told himself the pain of not knowing was better than the pain of watching them look at him with confusion or pity or rage. But some lies grow heavier with time. And tonight, In the quiet darkness of the guest quarters, Clement felt the weight of every year he had wasted. Franklin's voice broke the silence, soft and careful. He asked if Clement was all right. Clement closed the journal. He said he was fine. He said he was just tired. The Marine did not push. He had his own ghosts, his own journal of losses written in the empty space where his legs used to be. He understood that some questions did not need answers, that sometimes presence was enough. Gerald spoke from across the aisle, his voice steadier than it had been at dinner. He said he had watched what happened in the wardroom. He said Clement had handled it with more grace than anyone could have expected. He said the commander did not deserve the dignity of a response, but Clement had given him one anyway. Clement shook his head slowly. He said dignity was all he had left. He said when everything else was gone, when the career and the family and the reasons for living had all slipped away, a man could still choose how he carried himself. He said the commander's mockery did not matter, because Whitfield did not know what he was mocking. And men who do not understand cannot truly hurt you. Franklin made a sound that might have been agreement. He said Clement sounded like a man who had figured some things out. Clement looked at the journal in his hands, at the worn leather that had traveled with him through decades of darkness. He said he had figured out how to survive. He said he had not figured out how to live. He said there was a difference, and he was only now beginning to understand how wide the gap between them was. The ship hummed around them, the constant vibration of nuclear reactors and ventilation systems creating a white noise that filled the silence. Tomorrow would bring the Veterans Day ceremony, the speeches and salutes, and carefully orchestrated displays of gratitude. Tomorrow would bring Commander Whitfield and whatever confrontation he was planning. But tonight, in the quiet of the guest quarters, 3 forgotten veterans sat with their ghosts and wondered if the morning would bring something different. Clement opened his journal one more time, turning to the page where Samuel Okonkwo's information was recorded. The coordinates of the beach, the date of the operation, the words he had whispered as the life left his eyes. Tell my mama I did good. 38 years. 38 years of carrying that message, of being unable to deliver it, of letting the weight of one failure define everything that came after. Clement closed the journal and turned off the reading light. In the darkness, he made a decision he had been avoiding for nearly 4 decades. If he survived whatever tomorrow brought, he would go to Baltimore. He would find Evelyn Okonkwo, and he would finally tell her about her son. Morning came with the sound of the ship's announcement system crackling to life, a bosun's whistle followed by the watch change and weather report. Clement had been awake for hours, lying still in the darkness, listening to the heartbeat of the vessel around him. Sleep had always been difficult. The nightmares came whether he slept on a mattress or concrete, whether he was surrounded by walls or open sky. He rose before Franklin and Gerald stirred, folding his blanket with corners sharp enough to satisfy any inspection. The donated suit hung on a hook near his rack, wrinkled from the previous evening, but still the best clothing he had worn in years. He dressed in silence, tucked his journal into the inside pocket, and made his way to the head to wash his face with water that ran hot when he wanted it to. The mirror showed him a man he barely recognized. 71 years old, skin weathered by decades of sun and wind and neglect. Gray hair cropped short because he still cut it himself with scissors borrowed from shelters. Eyes that held depths most people could not fathom and did not want to explore. He looked like what he was, a man who had outlived his usefulness and was waiting for permission to stop. But something had shifted during the night. The decision to find Evelyn Okonkwo had cracked something open inside him, released a pressure he had not known he was carrying. For the first time in years, Clement had a purpose beyond mere survival. He had a mission, even if that mission was simply delivering words he should have spoken decades ago. The Veterans Day ceremony was scheduled for 1,000 hours on the flight deck. Dignitaries would speak. Sailors would stand in formation. The national anthem would play, while cameras captured the Navy's tribute to those who had served. The homeless veterans had been assigned seats in the back, visible enough to demonstrate compassion, far enough to avoid scrutiny. Clement made his way to the mess deck for breakfast, navigating passageways that felt familiar despite the decades since he had walked them. The ship was alive with activity, sailors in working uniforms rushing to complete tasks before the ceremony began. Most of them did not notice the old man in the ill-fitting suit. Those who did looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the reminder of what service could become. He found a seat in the corner, a tray of powdered eggs and toast in front of him, and watched the controlled chaos of a carrier preparing for a major event. Young men and women who had never known war moved with purpose and energy, their careers still bright with possibility. Clement remembered being one of them, remembered believing that the uniform made him invincible and the mission would never end. Chief Washington found him there, sliding into the seat across the small table with a tray of his own. The historian's face was drawn, evidence of a sleepless night spent in archives and phone calls. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He said he had spent the night confirming what he suspected. He said he had spoken with a retired captain who had served in naval special warfare during the 80s. He said the captain remembered Spectre. Everyone who served in that era remembered Spectre. Clement continued eating, his expression unchanged. He asked what the captain had said. Washington leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that would not carry beyond their table. He said the captain had described Spectre as the most effective operator he had ever known. He said the missions attributed to that call sign were studied at the Naval Special Warfare Center, taught to new generations as examples of what was possible when skill and courage aligned. He said the captain had believed Spectre was dead, killed in some unmarked grave in a country that would never acknowledge his presence. Clement set down his fork. He said he supposed he was dead in all the ways that mattered. Washington shook his head. He said that was not true. He said what Clement had done, the lives he had saved, the operations he had completed, those things mattered. He said the intelligence from Libya had saved thousands of sailors, including a young lieutenant named Patricia Vance. The name landed like a stone in still water. Clement looked up, meeting Washington's eyes for the first time. He asked the historian to repeat what he had said. Washington explained. He said Admiral Vance had been assigned to the task force that received the intelligence Clement's team extracted. He said she had spent her entire career not knowing who to thank for her survival. He said she was the keynote speaker for today's ceremony, and she had been up all night as well, reviewing records and making calls of her own. Clement sat in silence, processing the information. The operations he had conducted were never meant to have faces attached to them. The people he protected were abstractions, numbers on briefing slides, strategic assets rather than human beings. Learning that one of them had become an admiral, had risen through the ranks to stand on the same deck where he now sat as a charity case, created a dissonance he could not immediately resolve. Washington continued. He said Vance wanted to meet with Clement before the ceremony. He said she had questions, and she had something she wanted to say. He said Commander Whitfield had been making noise about exposing the homeless veteran as a fraud, and Vance wanted to ensure that did not happen. Clement asked why the Admiral would care about a homeless man's reputation. Washington's answer was simple. He said she cared because she owed him her life. He said debts like that did not expire, regardless of how much time passed or how far circumstances had diverged. He said Vance was not the kind of officer who forgot where she came from or who had made her career possible. The mess deck continued its controlled chaos around them, sailors finishing meals and rushing to their duty stations. The ceremony was less than 2 hours away. Commander Whitfield was somewhere on this ship, preparing whatever humiliation he had planned. And Admiral Patricia Vance, a woman who had survived because of intelligence Clement had nearly died to obtain, wanted to meet the ghost who had saved her. Clement pushed his tray aside. He looked at Washington and asked where the Admiral wanted to meet. Washington stood collecting his own tray. He said she was waiting in her quarters. He said he would escort Clement there now, if he was willing. Clement rose from his seat, straightening the donated suit that hung loose on his frame. He had spent 22 years avoiding recognition, avoiding anyone who might connect the homeless man to the operator he had been. But hiding had not brought peace. Running had not delivered salvation. Perhaps it was time to stop being a ghost and remember what it meant to be seen. He followed Washington out of the mess deck, leaving his half-eaten breakfast behind. The passageways of the carrier stretched before him, leading toward a conversation he had never expected to have and a ceremony that would change everything. Admiral Vance's quarters were located in officer country, a compartment that reflected her rank with modest accommodations that would have seemed Spartan to civilians but luxurious to anyone who had slept in enlisted berthing. A desk occupied one corner, covered with papers and a laptop displaying documents Clement could not read from the doorway. A small sitting area held two chairs facing each other across a low table. The bulkheads were decorated with photographs spanning decades of service, ships and crews, and ceremonies marking a career built on the intelligence he had nearly died to deliver. She stood when Washington escorted Clement through the door, and for a long moment neither spoke. The Admiral was 58 years old, silver threading through hair that had once been dark, her uniform pressed to perfection, stars gleaming on her collar. She looked at the homeless veteran in his donated suit, at the weathered face and cracked hands, and saw something that made her eyes glisten. She dismissed Washington with a nod, waiting until the door closed before she spoke. Her voice was steady but soft, carrying the weight of words she had rehearsed through a sleepless night. She said she did not know where to begin. She said she had spent 37 years wondering about the people who saved her life, imagining them as abstractions, as names in classified files she would never be cleared to read. She said she never expected to meet one of them, and certainly not like this. Clement stood near the door, uncertain whether to sit or remain standing. The protocol of his former life felt distant, the customs and courtesies of rank blurred by decades of existing outside any structure. He said he was not sure what the Admiral expected from him. Vance gestured to one of the chairs. She said she expected nothing. She said she simply wanted to understand, if understanding was possible. She wanted to know how a man who had done what he had done ended up sleeping on streets, while the people he protected climbed to positions of power and comfort. Clement lowered himself into the chair, his joints protesting the movement. He set his journal on the table between them, the worn leather a barrier and a bridge. He said that was a long story. Vance took the chair across from him. She said they had time, and so Clement told her. Not everything, not the classified details that would remain buried until long after both of them were gone, but the shape of it. The extraction in Libya, the firefight on the beach, Samuel Okonkwo bleeding out in the shallows while Clement held him and promised to deliver a message he could never bring himself to speak. He told her about the years after, the operations that continued until his body began to fail and the Navy decided he had given enough. The retirement that felt like exile. The wife who held them together until a stroke took her between heartbeats. The sons he abandoned because he convinced himself his darkness would poison their light. He told her about the streets, the shelters, the slow erasure of identity that came from being invisible, from passing through a world that looked through you rather than at you. He told her about the journal, the coordinates and names that kept him tethered to a past he could not escape, the nightly ritual of reading entries like prayers to the dead. Vance listened without interruption, her expression shifting through emotions she did not try to hide. When he finished, silence filled the compartment, broken only by the hum of the ship around them. She spoke carefully, choosing each word. She said she could not imagine carrying what he carried. She said the Navy had failed him, that the systems designed to support veterans had allowed a hero to fall through cracks wide enough to swallow decades. She said she was sorry, though she knew the word was inadequate. Clement shook his head. He said he did not want apologies. He said the choices that led him here were his own, and blaming systems or institutions was just another way of avoiding responsibility. He said he had run from his pain instead of facing it, and running had cost him everything that mattered. Vance leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her eyes locked on his. She asked what he wanted now. She asked if there was anything she could do, any door she could open, any wrong she could help make right. Clement thought about the question. He thought about Marcus in Atlanta and Daniel in Seattle, sons who had become strangers. He thought about Evelyn Okonkwo in Baltimore, waiting for a message that was 38 years overdue. He thought about the ceremony that would begin in less than an hour, the speeches and salutes, and carefully orchestrated displays of gratitude. He said he wanted to deliver a message. He said Samuel Okonkwo died, asking him to tell his mother he did good, and Clement had never found the courage to knock on her door. He said if he could do one thing, if the Admiral could help him do one thing, it would be that. Vance nodded slowly. She said she could make that happen. She said after the ceremony, she would personally ensure Clement reached Baltimore, reached Evelyn Okonkwo, reached the closure he had been denying himself for nearly 4 decades. But first, she said, there was the matter of Commander Whitfield. Clement's expression did not change. He said the commander was not his concern. He said young officers with more ambition than wisdom were a constant in every era, and Whitfield would learn his lessons one way or another. Vance's jaw tightened. She said Whitfield was her concern. She said she had tolerated his behavior because he was effective at logistics and event coordination, but what she witnessed in the wardroom crossed lines that effectiveness could not excuse. She said she intended to address it publicly during the ceremony in a way that would leave no doubt about the Navy's values. Clement asked her not to do that. He said public humiliation served no purpose except feeding the ego of the humiliator. He said if she wanted to honor him, she should do it by honoring the men who did not come home. She should speak Samuel's name. She should acknowledge the cost of the intelligence that saved her task force. She should make the ceremony about sacrifice, not spectacle. Vance studied him for a long moment. She said she understood. She said she would find another way to address Whitfield, one that did not turn Clement's pain into a performance. She stood and extended her hand. Clement rose and took it, his grip firm despite the years of neglect. They stood like that for a moment, two people connected by events that had shaped their lives in ways neither fully understood. Then Vance said something that nearly broke him. She said thank you. She said those words had been waiting 37 years to be spoken, and she was grateful she finally had the chance to say them. Clement nodded, unable to trust his voice. He retrieved his journal from the table and followed the Admiral toward the door. The ceremony was about to begin, and nothing would go the way Commander Whitfield expected. The flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt stretched like a steel prairie under the Pacific sun, 4.5 acres of American power arranged for ceremony. Sailors stood in formation, their dress whites brilliant against the gray of the deck and the blue of the sky. Dignitaries occupied a raised platform near the island superstructure, politicians and senior officers seated in rows of folding chairs. Television cameras had been positioned at strategic angles, ready to broadcast the Navy's tribute to its veterans across the nation. Clement stood at the back of the designated viewing area, Franklin's wheelchair beside him, Gerald on his other side. The seats assigned to the homeless veterans were the last row, partially obscured by a communications array, visible enough to demonstrate inclusion without being prominent enough to distract from the polished presentation. Commander Whitfield moved through the crowd near the platform, a clipboard in his hand, directing sailors and adjusting details with the intensity of a man whose career depended on perfection. He had not approached Clement since the previous evening, but his eyes found the old veteran repeatedly, a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors, the national anthem performed by a sailor whose voice carried clear and strong across the flight deck. Clement stood at attention without thinking, his body responding to decades of conditioning, his hand rising to his heart in the civilian gesture he had adopted since leaving service. Beside him, Franklin straightened in his wheelchair, and Gerald's trembling hands went still against his sides. Speeches followed, politicians speaking of sacrifice and service in words that felt rehearsed, officers reciting statistics about veteran programs and support initiatives. Clement listened without hearing, his mind drifting to other ceremonies on other decks, memorials for men who had not come home, flags folded into triangles and handed to widows who tried not to collapse under the weight. Admiral Vance took the podium as the keynote speaker, and the quality of the air seemed to change. She stood with the authority of someone who had earned every star on her collar, her voice carrying across the flight deck without amplification. She began with the expected remarks, honoring the veterans in attendance, thanking them for their service, acknowledging the debt the nation owed to those who had worn the uniform. But then her tone shifted, became more personal, more direct. She said she wanted to tell a story. She said it was a story that had shaped her entire career, though she had only learned the full truth in the past 12 hours. She said in 1986, she was a young lieutenant aboard a destroyer operating in the Mediterranean. She said her task force had received intelligence that allowed them to avoid an ambush, intelligence that saved over 2,000 sailors from a fate none of them knew they were facing. The flight deck was silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Vance continued. She said that intelligence came at a cost. She said a team of 4 Americans had inserted into hostile territory to extract it, and one of them did not come home. She said his name was Petty Officer First Class Samuel Okonkwo, and he died on a beach in Libya so that she and her shipmates could live. Clement felt his knees weaken. He gripped the back of Franklin's wheelchair to steady himself, his heart pounding against his ribs. Samuel's name, spoken aloud on the deck of an aircraft carrier, acknowledged for the first time in 38 years. Vance was not finished. She said the team leader of that operation carried a call sign that became legend in the special operations community. She said he was known as Spectre, and the missions attributed to that name were studied at training centers as examples of what courage and skill could accomplish. She said for decades, she had wondered who Spectre was, had imagined him as a myth, a composite, a story told to inspire young operators. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Clement at the back of the viewing area. She said she no longer had to wonder. She said Spectre was here, on this deck, wearing a donated suit because the country he served had allowed him to fall through the cracks of a system that should have caught him. She said his name was Master Chief Petty Officer Clement Adeyemi, and he was the reason she was alive to give this speech. The silence shattered into murmurs that rippled across the flight deck. Heads turned, searching for the man the Admiral had named. Officers who had been half listening snapped to attention. The television cameras, sensing the shift in energy, began panning toward the back of the viewing area. Commander Whitfield stood frozen near the platform, his clipboard forgotten in his hands. His face had gone pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as the implications of the Admiral's words crashed over him like a wave. Vance raised her hand, and the murmurs faded. She said she was not telling this story to embarrass anyone or to create spectacle. She said she was telling it because veterans like Master Chief Adeyemi deserve to be seen. She said they deserve to be acknowledged not as charity cases or photo opportunities, but as the heroes they were. She invited Clement to join her on the platform. The walk from the back of the viewing area to the raised stage felt like miles. Clement moved through the parted crowd, sailors and officers stepping aside with expressions that mixed shock with reverence. Franklin wheeled himself forward to maintain line of sight, tears streaming down the Marine's weathered face. Gerald followed, his hands steady for the first time in years. Clement climbed the steps to the platform, his worn shoes loud against the metal. He stood beside Admiral Vance, facing a sea of white uniforms and cameras, feeling exposed in a way that combat had never made him feel. Vance turned to him. She said there was something she needed to do, something that was 37 years overdue. She stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. For a moment, Clement did not move. He had not been saluted in over 2 decades. He had not been seen as anything worth saluting in longer than he could remember. But muscle memory runs deeper than circumstance, deeper than years of invisibility, deeper than the weight of all the things he had lost. He straightened his spine. He squared his shoulders. And Master Chief Petty Officer Clement Adeyemi returned the salute with a precision that made the decades fall away, that transformed the homeless man in the donated suit back into the operator who had moved through shadows and saved lives that would never know his name. The flight deck erupted. Sailors broke formation to applaud. Officers rose from their seats. The sound rolled across the steel expanse like thunder, like a wave breaking against a shore, like 38 years of silence finally finding its voice. And in the midst of it all, Commander Whitfield stood motionless, watching everything he thought he knew collapse into the recognition of how terribly, completely wrong he had been. The applause continued for what felt like hours, waves of sound washing over the flight deck as sailors who had never heard a Spectre joined those who recognized the legend in honoring a man they had overlooked. Clement stood beside Admiral Vance, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the cameras, beyond the moment that threatened to overwhelm him. Vance let the ovation continue before raising her hand for silence. When the deck quieted, she spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of command and something softer beneath it. She said she had one more thing to address. She said the previous evening, in the wardroom of this ship, Master Chief Adeyemi had been subjected to treatment that did not reflect the values of the United States Navy. She said he had been mocked, questioned, and humiliated by an officer who should have known better. She said that officer was present on this deck, and she wanted him to step forward. The crowd shifted, next craning to find the target of the Admiral's words. Commander Whitfield stood near the platform, his face ashen, his body rigid with the knowledge of what was coming. For a moment, it seemed he might try to disappear into the mass of uniforms around him. Then, with the mechanical movements of a man walking to his own execution, he stepped forward and climbed the stairs to the platform. He stood at attention before Admiral Vance, his eyes forward, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cables. The flight deck was silent, for 1,000 sailors watching their commander face judgment. Vance did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said Commander Whitfield had asked Master Chief Adeyemi about his kill count. She said he had done so as a joke, expecting to humiliate a man he assumed was a fraud. She said she wanted the commander to hear the answer now, in front of everyone he had tried to impress. She turned to Clement. She asked if he would be willing to respond to the commander's question. Clement looked at Whitfield, at the young officer whose arrogance had crumbled into terror. He remembered his conversation with Vance in her quarters, his request that she not turn his pain into spectacle. But this was different. This was not humiliation for its own sake. This was truth, spoken plainly, so that everyone present would understand the weight of what they had witnessed. He spoke, and his voice carried across the flight deck with the clarity of a man who had learned to make himself heard in chaos. He said 47 confirmed. He said 17 of them came on the night Samuel Okonkwo died, in a firefight that lasted 11 minutes on a beach that does not appear on any map. He said each of those 47 was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. He said he'd carried their faces for decades, not as trophies, but as wounds that never healed. He said after a certain point, the numbers stopped meaning what people thought they meant. He said killing was not something to boast about at dinner tables. It was weight, pure and simple, weight that accumulated with each trigger pull until you learned to carry it or it crushed you. He looked directly at Whitfield. He said the commander had asked a question he was not prepared to hear answered. He said that was the difference between men who talked about war and men who had lived it. Whitfield's composure finally broke. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. He said he was sorry. He said he had no excuse. He said he had made assumptions based on appearance and had been wrong in ways he was only beginning to understand. Vance stepped forward. She said sorry was a start, but it was not enough. She said Commander Whitfield would be relieved of his duties as ceremony coordinator effective immediately. She said a formal review of his conduct would be initiated upon return to port. She said the Navy did not tolerate the treatment of any veterans in the manner he had displayed. Whitfield nodded, accepting the judgment without protest. He turned to Clement one final time, his eyes meeting the old veteran's gaze. He said he hoped someday he could earn the right to apologize properly. Then he descended the platform stairs and disappeared into the crowd, his career in ruins, his certainty shattered. The ceremony resumed, but its character had changed. The remaining speeches felt different, more genuine, as if the revelation of Clement's identity had stripped away the performative layer and exposed something real beneath. When the final benediction was offered, When the sailors were dismissed and the formations dissolved, no one rushed to leave. They lingered, gathering in clusters, processing what they had witnessed. Chief Washington found Clement near the edge of the platform, where the old veteran stood looking out at the Pacific horizon. He said the story was already spreading. He said sailors were calling family members, posting on social media, sharing the legend of Spectre with anyone who would listen. He said by the time the ship reached port, the whole country would know. Clement shook his head slowly. He said he did not want fame. He said the men who deserve recognition were the ones who did not come home. He said if people wanted to honor someone, they should honor Samuel Okonkwo. Washington nodded. He said he would make sure Samuel's name was included in everything written about today. He said he would find Evelyn Okonkwo and ensure she knew her son's sacrifice was finally being acknowledged. Franklin wheeled himself to Clement's side, Gerald following close behind. The Marine extended his hand, and Clement took it, two veterans connected by something deeper than words. Franklin said it was an honor to have met him. He said watching Clement stand on that platform, watching him reclaim what the years had tried to take from him, had given Franklin something he thought he had lost forever. Clement asked what that was. Franklin smiled, the first genuine smile Clement had seen on his face. He said hope. He said if a man who had fallen as far as Clement could find his way back to recognition, maybe there was hope for all of them. Maybe the country had not completely forgotten the men who bled for it. Gerald spoke, his voice steadier than it had been in years. He said he was going to call his daughter. He said they had not spoken in 5 years, but watching Clement face his past made him realize he needed to face his own. He said some silences lasted too long, and the only way to break them was to start speaking. Clement looked at the two men who had become unexpected brothers over the past 2 days. He said they should all make the calls they had been avoiding. He said he had his own silence to break, a mother in Baltimore who had been waiting 38 years for news of her son. Admiral Vance approached, her formal demeanor softened by something that looked like peace. She said a helicopter was being prepared to transport Clement to the mainland. She said a car would be waiting to take him wherever he needed to go. She said the Navy owed him more than it could ever repay, but this was a start. Clement thanked her. He said he had one request. He asked if Franklin and Gerald could come with him, at least as far as the mainland. He said they had their own journeys to begin, and he did not want them to start alone. Vance nodded without hesitation. She said she would make the arrangements. The Pacific stretched endless and blue beneath the afternoon sun, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Baltimore waited with a message 38 years overdue. 3 months had passed since the ceremony on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Winter had settled over Baltimore, and the row house on Ashland Avenue wore a thin coat of frost on its brick facade. Clement stood on the sidewalk, his hands buried in the pockets of coat that actually fit, watching the windows for signs of movement. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, just as he had stood outside this same house 3 times before over the past 38 years. But this time was different. This time he would not walk away. The Navy had provided him with housing, a small apartment in San Diego near the naval base where he had once trained young operators. They had connected him with medical care, therapy, a pension that had been accumulating interest for 2 decades. Chief Washington had helped him navigate the bureaucracy, cutting through red tape with the same determination he brought to historical research. Admiral Vance had called twice, checking on his progress, asking if he needed anything. She had become an unexpected ally, a reminder that the service he gave had mattered to someone beyond the classified files and forgotten operations. Franklin was in a veterans rehabilitation facility in Phoenix, learning to use new prosthetics that would let him walk for the first time in 50 years. Gerald had reunited with his daughter, was living in her spare bedroom in Oregon, was learning to be a grandfather to children who had never known he existed. And Clement had made his own calls. Marcus had answered on the 3rd ring, his surgeon's voice cautious and controlled until he realized who was speaking. Daniel had not answered at all the first time, or the 2nd, but on the 3rd attempt he had picked up and listened in silence while Clement spoke the words he should have spoken 22 years ago. They were not ready to see him. Not yet. The wounds were too deep, the absence too long, the explanations too complicated to absorb in a single conversation. But the door was open. The silence was broken. And Clement had learned that healing did not happen all at once. It happened in increments, in small steps forward in the daily choice to keep trying. Now he stood in Baltimore, facing the final task he had set for himself. The message he had carried since a beach in Libya turned red with his brother's blood. The door of the row house opened before he could knock. A woman stood in the doorway, 89 years old, her hair white as snow, her eyes sharp with an intelligence that age had not dimmed. She wore a housecoat and slippers, and she looked at Clement as if she had been expecting him for decades. She said she knew who he was. She said she had seen the news coverage, the videos from the ship, the stories about the homeless veteran who turned out to be a legend. She said she had been waiting for him to find his way to her door. Clement's voice failed him. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, had practiced the words in shelters and under bridges and in the small apartment the Navy had provided. But standing before Evelyn Okonkwo, looking into eyes that held the same warmth he remembered in her son, every prepared phrase dissolved into silence. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. She said he looked cold. She said she had coffee on the stove and photographs he needed to see. The inside of the row house was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and something baking. The walls were covered with pictures, and Clement's breath caught when he saw them. Samuel at every age, from infant to teenager to young man in uniform. Samuel smiling, Samuel serious, Samuel in his dress whites with the trident gleaming on his chest. Evelyn guided him to a worn sofa and placed a cup of coffee in his hands. She sat across from him in a chair that had molded itself to her shape over decades of use. She did not speak. She simply waited, giving him the space to find his words. Clement set down the coffee. He opened his mouth to deliver the message he had carried for 38 years, but what came out was not what he had planned. He said he was sorry. He said Samuel died because he missed a shot, because he was half a second too slow, because he failed the man who trusted him most. He said he'd spent nearly 4 decades hating himself for that failure, running from it, hiding from everyone who might remind him of what he had lost. Evelyn leaned forward. She took his weathered hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. She said she had something to show him. She rose and retrieved a wooden box from a shelf near the photographs. She opened it and removed a folded letter, yellowed with age, the creases worn soft from repeated reading. She placed it in Clement's hands. She said Samuel had written it 2 weeks before the operation. She said he had given it to a chaplain with instructions to send it to her if anything happened. She said she had read it 1,000 times, and now she wanted Clement to read it too. Clement unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. Samuel's handwriting was neat, precise. The letters formed with the same care he had brought to everything he did. The letter spoke of the operation they were planning, without details that would compromise security. It spoke of the risks involved, the knowledge that not everyone might come home. And then it spoke of Clement. Samuel had written that if something happened to him, his mother should know it was not anyone's fault. He wrote that war did not care about fault, that bullets did not discriminate, that the men who survived carried enough weight without adding guilt that did not belong to them. He wrote that Clement was the best operator he had ever known, the best friend he had ever had, and that if Samuel died under his command, it would be while doing exactly what he was meant to do. The letter ended with 5 words that broke something open inside Clement, something that had been locked away for 38 years. Tell old man I did good. Clement wept. He wept like he had not wept since Adora died, since he walked away from his sons, since he held Samuel in the shallows and watched the light leave his eyes. He wept for the years he had wasted, the guilt he had carried, the message he had been too broken to deliver. Evelyn held him. She held him like a mother holds a son, like Samuel would have held him if their positions had been reversed. She said her boy had known what he was doing. She said he had chosen his path, chosen his brothers, chosen to give everything for the people he loved. She said that was not failure. That was honor. When Clement finally composed himself, when the tears had run their course and the weight had shifted into something bearable, he looked at Evelyn and spoke the words he had carried across oceans and decades. He said Samuel did good. He said Samuel was the bravest man he ever knew. He said not a day passed that he did not think of him, did not hear his laugh, did not see his face in the darkness before sleep. Evelyn smiled, and in that smile Clement saw Samuel, saw the warmth and courage and unshakable faith that had defined her son. She said she knew. She said she had always known. She said Samuel had sent her that knowledge in every letter, every phone call, every moment they shared before he shipped out for the last time. She asked Clement to stay for dinner. She said she wanted to hear stories about her son, the ones that never made it into official reports, the ones only a brother would know. Clement stayed. He stayed for dinner and for coffee afterward and for hours of conversation that stretched into the evening. He told her about Samuel's laugh, about his courage, about the way he called Clement old man and never hesitated when it mattered most. And when he finally left, when he stood on the sidewalk in the Baltimore cold with Evelyn's embrace still warm on his shoulders, Clement felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt light. The weight was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something he could carry. Not a burden, a bond, a connection to the brother he had lost and the life that still stretched before him. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we do not always recognize, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of courage, sacrifice, and redemption. And if you have ever judged someone by their appearance, if you have ever overlooked the quiet dignity of a stranger, remember that every person you pass carries a story. Some of those stories are legendary. Some of those stories are waiting to be told. Thank you for watching, and remember to honor the hidden heroes in your own life. They are closer than you think.